Welcome to A Wealthy Life. My name's Vicky Boucher and I'm the host. The aim of this show is to help you pinpoint your values and create a plan to live your version of a truly wealthy life, doing more of what you want, more of what you love, with those that matter to you most. And that will take time, money, and control to create this life of your dreams. I've had times when I've had to track literally every penny, shouldering massive debt. And then, after being made redundant and a divorce, I decided I needed to create an independent source of income, something away from traditional employment. I began investing in 2004, and during the property crash of 2009-10, I bought on average 1 to 2 properties a month. After just 2 years of focused investment, I'd secured my financial future. By 2013, I'd been recognised by The Telegraph as one of the UK's top 25 most influential people in property. I've authored 5 books, and property investment has been my ticket to a life of financial security, fun, freedom, adventure, great holidays. It's a life guided by my values and not societal norms. So why not subscribe now and become inspired to create your own wealthy life?
Hello and welcome. My name's Vicky Boucher and this is a Wealthy Life podcast. And I'm here with Hayley Andrews, and you might recognize her. This is our second conversation. So hello, Hayley, and welcome back.
Hello, thank you for having me back. I'm excited to cover this session.
Excellent. So when we were speaking the first time, we were talking about what it was like being a woman in property, really. And there was a group of women that I was speaking to, and we were talking sort of hard hats and high heels as a conversation. But I realized out of that while that was interesting, I think, to women listeners and maybe even for men to learn a bit about it, what we were also missing out on was the core of your knowledge, which is really about development in many different guises. And I still look at you and think, goodness, she's not far over 20. How can she have done all of this? But we'll come to all of that.
Double that. Double that.
Well, yeah, I know, but you're wearing well. So what we'll do is we'll stick the link to that first conversation in the show notes, obviously. But this time we're very much going to focus on the broader topic of development. And I know that one of the things that we were talking about that you do, apart from museums and halves and actual refurbishments in the sense that we would think of refurbishments and office conversions, is sometimes go in where an existing developer has got it wrong or maybe gone broke, run out of money, whatever, and you're taking over part-started developments. What's gone wrong that they're having to sell before they finish? Should we start there as a sort of a step in, because that might give us an idea of some of the things that can go wrong in development?
Yeah, I think, majority of the reasons I would step in comes down to cash flow and struggling financially. So the developers, the projects have run over, they've gone over budget, there may be enforcement notices attached to the property, they've done some things wrong, perhaps changed windows, etc. in conservation areas. So minor kind of issues, but cost money to put right. So the types of developments that I'll step in on are those that have already done the hard work as such, and then I kind of solve the problems, finish the project off, and then either rent or sell.
Nice. And I think probably done the hard work is that bit of getting out the ground. I know when we did a development, that's where the disasters lie.
Well, that's where the risk is. So if you can pick up a site or even a project where it's a factory or, a museum or an office, you don't have those issues because everything that has been an issue has already been either resolved in that scenario, or you're fully aware of it, so can plan that into your figures. So it just takes the risk away.
Yeah, because again, as I say, when we did one here, we dug boreholes so that we understood, what the ground was consisted of. We knew there was clay. We found that the water table was at 1 meter, and we needed 1.1 foundation, of course. But we were in a dry season and everything was going fine, and we dug all the foundations, and for whatever reason the builders that we were using didn't board out the foundations, didn't put wood against all the edges to hold them, because it was all going fine, of course, until it didn't. And then literally we were due to finish on the Friday and the cement was due to come on the Monday, and on the Thursday night we had a torrential downpour, and that was it. Just great swathes of cave-ins on the foundations, and we had to start again. So yeah, it's been a challenge, isn't it? And that's before you even get to utilities, which must be a nightmare on developments, working with they're almost like, I don't want to say Titanics, what do I mean? Like giant ships that turn really slowly, of the utility companies.
Very slowly. And utilities are a massive issue with development, and quite often when people are starting out, they don't think about the utilities, and they can massively prolong a project as a result of the turnaround time to get that sorted. And if you're on bridging finance and you're paying interest, and you have your loan is coming to fruition, and that's outstanding, then that's something that's a huge problem. And we often see that developers getting into trouble by not actually starting that process earlier.
Yeah, let's just pick up on that point about bridging finance, because that's a way a lot of people get going when they're looking at development. And I'm sure that that's just because of the sums involved. You know, it's a bit different buying a house. You're looking at a deposit maybe, but when you're either buying a house and pulling it down so there's nothing, then you're not going to get your regular mortgage. You're looking at development finance, and that sort of development finance or bridging of some sort is much, much more expensive money, isn't it?
It is, but it's necessary in development. So you've got to be comfortable with bridging, because if you have a site and it doesn't have planning permission, you will have to use bridge to development finance. You can't actually switch to development finance until you have the planning in place. So it's a process. So it's kind of like structuring the finance correctly to that particular development and deal. So I would say, if you're doing development, you've got to be okay with bridging. And as I always say, yes, it is more expensive and there's risk involved and high penalty charges if you can't pay it back on time or if a project goes over. But you don't look at the cost of the shovel when you're digging for gold, and you can absorb all of that as part of your upfront figures and make sure that you're putting contingencies in place to minimize your risk as much as possible. Now, I'm not being naive here and saying that sometimes things don't go, things always go swimmingly. They don't, and there have been times where we have incurred those penalty charges and not been able to pay the bridging loans back in time as a result of a project being prolonged for various different reasons: materials costing more money, supply for labour. Brexit caused a huge issue with supply of materials. We had to wait longer for things to come through, spend more money to get them. So there's been kind of lots of it's been a nice cocktail of disaster the last maybe 3 years of development, I would say, probably possibly 4.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because without being rude, if I class you like this, you're a smaller developer. And then when we think about your Wimpys and your Barretts and the big names that we understand, and then there's government, and government isn't a developer anymore. You know, there was a period when they would build houses, they were building council properties. But we're now looking at an island that requires more decent, habitable properties for people to live in.
Yeah.
And yet, probably there's two things that cause a problem. Obviously, we're on an island and there's only so much land, and we want to protect the green belt, blah, blah, blah. But then everything that would make it possible for either the bigger developers to do more or for smaller developers to get involved is around the finance. And yet that is so expensive. I mean, can you talk a little to that? I mean, I know when we looked at one point, maybe because it was going to be one of my first big developments, they were looking at 15% plus money in, plus money out. And it was just ridiculous costs that at the end of it, I felt that the risk was too high because we had trees on there that we weren't sure that we were going to get the permission to take them down, even though they weren't TPO'd, weren't protected trees. What's your views on the cost of money? Do you think it's too high? I mean, or do you think it's reasonable that the lenders charge that much for the risk that they're taking at their end?
Well, that's exactly what they're doing. And if you put yourself in their shoes and you look at obviously the amount of money that they loan to individuals and developers, they've got to attach risk to it. So yes, I mean, interest rates are high, and we have been spoiled for, over a decade with, low interest rates, and it has been more difficult as a developer to make projects stack as a result of interest rates being so high and lending being so expensive. However, these are all things that we can actually look at up front. So we identify a site, we can factor that in, we can speak to our broker, find out what finance options are available to us and the best way to package that up and structure that deal, and then factor those numbers into the overall development. And yes, it does mean that less developments come off because the profit margins are not there. But we know as professionals we're doing that up front, so we don't get caught in a development and then not making the profit we're expecting.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you've talked about a profit, and I think I was on a Facebook group about property, and there was one person on there that commented, property should not be about profit, it should be about people, and the rich just are greedy, or something to that point. I mean, there was a bit of me where I had to go and click on this person's link to go, why are you actually in a group that is all about property investing if you're so anti-property investing? But often there are just trolls that join groups for the sheer hell of it. So, and then I was thinking, well, why can't it be about profit? Because another word for profit is wages, or the reward for risk. If you don't make a profit from doing a deal, I can't imagine a reason why Hayley Andrews would take over somebody else's failed project, and then from that failed project then go, I tell you what, I'm going to do all of this, I'm going to put my time in, I'm going to be away from my family, I'm not going to worry about making any wages for myself, and I won't eat and turn the lights on, and then out of the goodness of my heart I'll take all the risk, and then I'll do this, and I'll just break even at the end, and I'll be really happy with it.
It has to be about profit, and you're always going to have trolls. At the end of the day, property for us is a business. So yes, we are providing good quality accommodation, affordable housing, much needed housing, might I add, and filling that gap and plugging that gap as much as we possibly can as small to medium-sized developers. But if profit isn't involved, why would I bother doing it? I'm not a charity. I'm not registered as a charity. And if I don't make money out of doing it, and I'm not ashamed to say that either, what's the point? That is my livelihood. And the money I make goes back into another project and another project and another project. And that means that I'm providing more and better accommodation and filling that gap more and more. And so I would really just ignore comments like that, to be honest. You're going to get it because people just assume that if you're in property, you're rich. But I started off, I came from a council estate and started off with nothing. I've climbed my way up that ladder and worked damn hard to get where I am. So why shouldn't I profit from it?
No, I agree with you. I mean, we have a situation at the moment where we're talking about food prices, but nobody's turning around to Tesco's and going, Tesco's, Sainsbury's, Waitrose, whoever, why aren't you just giving me the food straight from the farmer? Why don't you pay to transport it here? There is a lot of media against us. But I think one of the things that came out of that is that if there is risk involved in building new properties, whether it's from above ground or actually breaking ground, then that is slowing down along with the cost of money and along with the limited amount of land that we have on our island, our ability to provide enough homes. Why is our government not more supportive of smaller businesses? And again, I know that you're not tiny, I'm just using small as opposed to
No,
the giant corps.
I mean, if you're building less than 500 houses a year, I think you classed as a small to medium, and I'm nowhere near 500.
Yeah, but I didn't mean it. What I was trying to say is I'm not meaning it in a derogative sense to
No,
other
that's
people. I'm
okay.
just the comparison between the corps. But actually, it's developers like you and like the people that I work with that we can change houses and bring them back, as you say, into affordable and decent housing that is not covered in damp and mold and all of this sort of stuff, that we are bringing houses back into the market for people to live in. And the more supply that we put in the market, actually, that will reduce the rents because there will be more properties available. So it's like, any insights, because I know that you're well connected, any insights into why we are so undervalued or unsupported in this industry?
I think that the government really want to be sitting with the 10 main house builders here in the UK. And that's really what they're promoting. And similar to the small time landlord with the rental reform and Section 24 and all things like that, it's kind of trying to stamp out the small to medium and just focus on the corporate and the people that are building in excess of 500,000 and things, 500. Yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
not 500. They don't anywhere near meet that target per year. But yeah, 500 houses and things like that. So I think it comes down to wanting it to be more of your larger players than you small to medium developers. And really what I don't think it's against us, as in I don't think it's been done deliberately. There's been a knock-on effect through lots of different things, Brexit, materials, main contractors going bust, budgeting and lead times going out of the window because of COVID. One of the biggest problems we've had since arguably Brexit, I would say, would be shortage of labour. And then you've got environmental sustainability, energy performance, and all things like that. It's all kind of come together, which has slowed down development massively. And it has affected us more because our profit margins are less because we're not building to scale as such. We're not building on the same scale as your large 10. So, of course, the profit margins are much less for us anyway. So mix all of that in with higher interest rates and then slow planning. Planning is a huge issue, and even though we're going through a planning reform and there's been some good news, in terms of PD and all things like that, the process is still way too long and it needs to be streamlined, and without it being streamlined, we're always going to see these problems, which of course keeps house prices high, keeps rents high. So the real issue here in the UK is the demand is growing year on year, yet the supply appears to be dwindling, not actually building. So I think the target is something like 500,000 houses per year, and they nowhere near hit that. They're probably in high twos. Nowhere near.
Yeah, and
so we're always from behind. So they do need small to medium size developers like you and I, and many people that we associate ourselves with. But unfortunately, the mixture of all of the things that have kind of been against us is stacking, which is why most people are going down the routes of commercial to residential and looking at de-risking the site from day one. They have a building, they can get lending. With that building, they got PD, so the process is much quicker in order to do that conversion, and they still either are building to rent or sell. So it's just about identifying, where the risk is, and it is in the ground. So that's why you've seen less of ground up developments, more of conversions over the last few years.
And just to sort of clarify for people who don't know, PD is permitted development, and that is where there are changes in, should we call it, housing policy that says that you can take, and it was pubs into flats, and then it's office blocks into flats and that type of stuff. And it's really interesting actually, because I remember thinking, and we were speaking about what we were up to during COVID a little while ago, that during COVID I spent a lot of time when I got bored with my tomatoes, rethinking things. So I surfaced all the roads and I restructured city centres, because one of the things that we got out of COVID was this idea of working from home. And therefore, there were a lot of companies that went, do we really need 4 floors in this block of offices? We don't. We really only need one, because only a quarter of the people are coming in, and we can do all this desk sharing thing. And there are some people that don't need to come in the office at all. So that's all great. And so we started to see companies thinking about how they are using office space, which is marvelous, because one of the things that you have about a city centre is how expensive residential properties are. Great. So if residential is expensive and land is limited because it is a condensed, built up, packed sort of space around a city centre by nature of it, and yet we've got these blocks of buildings that are basically being underused, permitted development is a perfect opportunity to bring in, subject to the layouts and everything else, a shed load more flats for people to live in, for example. And it will mostly be conversions to flats, because it tends to be blocks that we're working with. So again, I know that that's something that you do. So have you seen yourself, like if you think about your percentages, like the pie chart of your business, would it have been, say, pre-COVID, a lot more out of the ground or housing that you were building, and now you've got this opportunity? Are you actively looking for more permitted development? Because as you say, the building's already out the ground, it's already got the utilities, 2 of the things that we spoke about. And now what you're doing is taking a floor plan and looking at how you can adapt that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If you look at the percentage of stuff that we're doing now, I'd say 85% of it is existing sites or commercial of some sort, whether that's factories, museums, or anything like that, offices, into residential. And the reason we are doing that is because it stacks better and there's less risk. So you have to look at, when you've got changes within the market, you've got changes within supply, you've got changes in interest rates, and a whole load of different stuff that are going on. It forces you out of the market slightly. Yes, there are sites that still work, but the number of sites that work are less. So therefore, we're looking at we're investors. We're only investors if we're investing. So we have to find a solution to that. And the solution is commercial to residential.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we've talked about, I suppose, involved in this conversation, let me pull them out, talked about the advantages of commercial to residential. You're out the ground, you've got the utilities, you've actually got a physical building that you can therefore get lending on, as opposed to you've got a flat piece of land that you've got to bridge till you're at a point where a lender will go, oh yes, there's some structure here, I will lend against the structure. So you've knocked off 3 of those things. What are other advantages, or the other way around, what are other risks involved in commercial to residential or permitted development?
Well, I think the risk with commercial to residential is, of course, knowing your customer, understanding what the end product is going to be. Just because a building can, under PD, be converted into residential, it doesn't necessarily mean that the end user is going to want to live there. So I think one of the main things with commercial to residential is upfront understanding, are you building to rent? Are you, or are you building to sell? If you're building to sell, what are people looking for in that area to buy? And understanding the flow of sales and things like that. Quite often what I see with commercial to residential is most people do the conversion to sell, but end up having to keep it and value it based off the income it's producing rather than resale value, because they didn't understand their audience. So I think when you're buying something existing and working with the structure of a building, you've got to understand your end user, and you've got to understand the flow of whether that's rental or sales. And you do have to be an expert within that area, and have done the research, because any building can be converted into whatever we want it to be. But ultimately, if the end user isn't there and the demand is low, or you're putting something that is maybe too expensive for that particular audience, or even the other way around, not good enough quality, not what they're looking for, then you will struggle to sell or rent it. So quite often, one of the biggest things I see, and that's one of the risks is you end up keeping those within your portfolio rather than selling.
But that affects your cash flow.
It does. It affects obviously the capital you release. But again, if you think about that up front and you say, well, okay, best case scenario, we sell at X. And even if we're factoring in, market drops or even a discount on the price, this is kind of the sliding scale and this is the profit we're looking to achieve. We do that from a rental perspective as well. And we say, right, okay, it works if we were to build and sell, but does it work if we can't sell? So we do all of that up front. So I think if you're doing it professionally, you have multiple options. And if you're buying right, you will have multiple options. So ultimately, it's about buying at the right price for what you're buying today, not factoring in what it can be in the future, which is what a lot of estate agents and, development sourcing agents will do. But ultimately, you're creating the value. So you buy at what you're buying now, which should be arguably much cheaper price per square foot if you're buying commercial, and then you're repurposing that to residential, whether that's for rental or sale. And you're making sure that, yes, if your primary strategy works, you make the profit you're looking to achieve with all of the contingencies in place, both time and money. But if it does end up renting out, what will it be valued at based off the income it's producing?
Yeah. So understanding your end customer. So really what you're doing is looking to predict demand, but also define demand, and then making sure that when you've done all of this, that you've got your two exit strategies. And I mean, I'm sure you do that when you're just buying for your own portfolio to hold. I still look at in everything that I do, right, okay, my primary goal is to buy it and keep it, because what I'm looking to do is to build some cash flow. But I also want to know that if it didn't work, or if I changed my mind, or for whatever reason I decide I want to sell it, what are my choices there? So always having both those choices. But very interestingly, because it's one of the things I've always talked about, we talk about tenants, and a lot of people don't like tenants. And I think of my tenants as customers. So as in any business, a business is never going to be profitable if there isn't demand from a customer. Who is my customer? What does my customer want? And you mentioned two things there. So making sure that it's, I suppose, the right product in the right location, because if we're talking commercial to residential, it could be very easy to pick, let's say an those sites that you go to where you've got your tool station and screw fix and those, and they're little metal units, and then there's lots of these. What if one of those came up and you suddenly build it, but what everybody's looking out at the other side of their front door is screw fix, tool station and Tile Giant and all of those other places? Yeah. Is that really where someone wants to live, smack in the middle of sort of like not really an industrial estate, commercial estate, So thinking about where you're putting it, who would want to live there, putting yourself in the mind of people, and then having done that, making sure that you are budgeting appropriately for the right quality product, because that's the trick, isn't it, with your two exit strategies? If your goal is to sell it, you may develop a product at one level, but then be forced to technically have overspent, because actually what you end up doing, renting, but you can't run the risk of producing it at the rental value, which is your fallback strategy, because then you definitely won't sell it. How do you manage this? Is it just experience?
I think it is. And I think it's, having good, solid contractors and your numbers up front again. I mean, the only things that really change is your kitchens, your bathrooms and your fixtures and fittings, which are expensive, don't get me wrong. However, the audience I never go high end. So I never play in, your high end market. I don't put that type of product back to the market. I go for mass and larger audiences. So that I can fit multiple different kind of people, basically. So I think it's easier for me. If you are targeting higher end, it's a massive risk, because obviously if you can't sell that asset, then you will have an awful lot of money left in, and the rental yield will be very low as a result. But it's not something that I've ever really had to kind of deal with, other than changing the taps and the door handles and the doors, just to a higher quality if we are selling. The actual fixtures and fittings are normally the same, and we're kind of mid-market. I never go high end, and I don't do, bottom end either. So if you sit in the middle, again, you've got that flexibility of choice to target a few different audiences, I guess. And again, it just comes from spreading your risk. If you do focus on low end, then you're going to struggle to sell from day one anyway. You're going to end up renting. If you focus on high end, you've got that massive overspend, and then the rental isn't going to achieve the levels that you would need in order for it to be a viable investment.
So if someone was thinking, because I've done a series of talks recently and been speaking to a lot of women, and there are a lot of women looking at, let me call them higher, I'm not going to call them higher cash flow, but higher cash strategies. So whether it's serviced accommodation, HMOs, or looking at smaller developments and this sort of stuff. If you're coming into this new and you're not an existing property portfolio owner, so you've not been in the business for a couple of years, you're looking at your first developments to come in because, and this is the reason why you're looking at this, because interest rates are high. Anybody says how high interest rates are, whereas I'm saying, well, actually, this is normal. If you go back 10 years, it was unusual the last few years. This is where your numbers need to work at, around the 5%. If your numbers work at 5%,
been stood up for over a decade.
Absolutely. If the numbers work at 5%, then you've been having a whale of a time up until now. But if your numbers only worked at 2 and 3%, and now you're trying to offload because you're in financial difficulty. So making sure that your numbers work at the right level. If you haven't got that level of experience, what would you say to someone newer or less experienced, seeing these changes in permitted development coming through and going, okay, I can do that? What would be your, I don't know, like top 3 tips or bewares or risks they should look out for?
So I would always say make sure that the site is actually in a good location. So while it can be in regeneration areas, etc., I mean the surroundings. So there's a mixture of residential and commercial. If you are looking at commercial to residential, it can be used as a residential property, and it's not just converting something because you can, because otherwise you will be stuck with that property. But I think probably the things that you should do is make sure that you speak to your tax advisor, because there's advantages of buying commercial buildings. Different stamp duty rating, things like that, which is much cheaper than residential. So a lot of people will find will want to go into the smaller shops with uppers. So a small site, you're not doing huge, 25 flats in an office, for example, but working on something smaller like that. So there's still advantages to that. You get kind of your foot on the ladder. It's not massively high risk. You've only got 3 or 4 units there, and it's easier, I guess, for you to, well, not easier, but the numbers obviously are easy for you to kind of work out. Trying to think where I'm going with this. Yeah, start with something smaller. It's still commercial to residential. You still got to identify your audience, so you get to practice that. The purchase price is going to be lower, so you risk, I guess, is less. To value 3 flats is going to be easier for you to do from comparable evidence and things like that. So you can understand your numbers a bit better, but you get to work with a main contractor. You understand then a JCT contract, you understand the whole process, tendering and all things like that, your schedule of works, you QS and all things. You can understand the different roles of your team on a smaller site, and then of course move on to something bigger. So I'd say probably the first one you should do is a smaller shops with uppers, a few units, and practice on that one. because things always go wrong. I mean, even to this day, you know, I'm going to give you, we're going to talk about an example perhaps later on of some horror stories. And
Oh no, go
God,
now. I'd love a horror story.
boy, do I have some horror stories. You know, it doesn't matter how experienced you are. One of the things I love about property is there's no site or property the same, and you're always kind of putting out fires and minimizing the risk here, and then all of a sudden finding a whole different risk that you wasn't potentially aware of up front. So there's always, people say to me, what do you do? And I always say, well, I solve problems. And that is what I do. You know, in every single site that I have, there's problems. In every single property I purchase or site I purchase, there's problems that I believe I can solve. And there are problems every single day. So I did a bank recently. It was derelict for 10 years. It had been used as office space. It was originally a bank, converted into offices. The safes and everything were still there. It was the first bank I'd done as well. So I'd not worked with a bank before. And it had been derelict for 10 years. It was like something out of the Jumanji house. I don't know whether you've watched that movie.
Yes.
It's got trees going through the middle of the
Oh wow.
issues all over. And this property was brought to me by the council. So it was owned by a private investor. They were international. And they purchased this site in auction and obviously found that they couldn't do anything with it because the costs were so high. So the council brought this to me because I work quite closely with the heritage officer within that particular area, and it was on the high street. And they asked if I would buy it, but I needed to pay about £100,000 too much for this property, of which, of course, I wasn't too happy about. But we structured a deal where they would fund the phase one, which is getting the property structurally sound, watertight, because there was no roof on one part. It had had water in just over the last 10 years and it had been set on fire. Kids had broken into there. The staircase was rotten. I had to kind of like climb up the staircase just to see upstairs originally when I viewed this property. Absolutely everything that you thought you could see could go wrong did, and then some. So I decided to buy the property at 203, I think it was, which I think still to this day was £100,000 more than what I wanted to pay for it, but it was what the seller needed. I could make it work at 103, so I was happy with it. However, anybody that knows me knows I love negotiations, so I wasn't so happy about paying what I felt was too much, which I would never normally do. But because this project was brought to me by the heritage officer, it was on the high street, and I knew that I could get grant funding for it, it would make it viable as such. I think the original costs for the project was about £410,000, and we ended up spending about £100,000 more. When we stripped the property back, there was the top half of the building was single skin, of which we wasn't aware of because it was like plaster all over, and it all looked perfectly fine. When we stripped it all back, there was one joist that was holding up the entire back end of the building that was rotten, but was encased, so we didn't see it initially. And it wasn't picked up on all of the surveys that we'd had done. And then ripping out, obviously, all of the plaster and everything back to brick, we then found that it used to have kind of window shutters, shop shutters.
Yeah.
The joists at the front of the building, again, wooden, were completely rotten, and they were holding up the entire front of the building. Again, we didn't know. So we ended up spending about £100,000 too much as well. However, grant funding did kick in, so we got about £365,000 worth of grant funding just to get the project back to brick, watertight and structurally sound. And then I had to then fund phase two, which was internal fit out and things like that. But from day one with that project, the main contractor had finance issues, so I ended up funding the first payment up front so that they could get started, which should be alarm bells. But because, again, this was through the council and because it was grant funding, it went out to tender and they chose who they would work with. So a bit about out of my control from a grant funding perspective. You have to kind of go with their preferred contractors as such. So that was one red flag for me. There was a project manager in place and a contract administrator in place, but I still went on site at least once a week because of my initial kind of gut feeling with this property. So not only did I fund the first kind of what should have been, they should have funded the first order. I funded the first upload to get the project started. They were behind from almost day one. So as we were getting the site kind of valued, so the contract administrator comes out, values the site, says, issues a certificate, you pay, the grant pays money, and you pay your percentage. That's how it kind of works. From the initial kind of stages, I could see what the contractor was doing, the main contractor was doing. It was under a JCT contract, so I'm not allowed to kind of interfere in that as the owner of the property, because it's all under their insurance contract and everything like that. And so I found myself turning up on site on a regular basis, clocking how many people were on site and how they were valuing the items that were coming in. So the contract administrator would value basically any materials that have been purchased, etc. And what I saw from the very beginning of the project was they were ordering all of the materials on site, but there were no labourers on site carrying out any work. So they were getting valuation certificates for the work as such that had been done, but no work was being done. There was just lots of materials on site. And I highlighted this from the first maybe 4 months in, that there's an issue here with labour. I've been keeping a diary. We've got, you're valuing the site. However, we've had steels on site for 2 months and nothing's been done with them. We've got windows on site, they haven't been put in yet. We've got this, that. And so I kept highlighting that there was an issue, and the issue came down to labour. And the reason the contractor didn't have labourers on site is because he couldn't afford to pay them. So we had kind of like a issue from day one there. Now, I didn't do anything wrong as a developer, I did everything I was supposed to do. Probably one thing I should have done, which I normally would do, but because it was actually through the grant process, I didn't really have too much of a choice on who we were working with. It was really, they went out to tender and then chose which contractor they wanted to work with under the grant funding process. Was I should have checked out, which I normally would if it's me, the financial stability of the main contractor. Yeah. As soon as I'd signed the JCT contract, I was kind of like, oh, I should have done it. And then I went back and looked at it and saw that he was in financial difficulty, but holding his head above water.
But then why, you see, this is what frustrates me about councils, because it happens time and time again. Why were the council giving the contract? Yes, you've gone out to tender. Yes, they've given you the best price, but why haven't you checked that they can deliver on the contract?
Because they're not business people. With all due respect, they don't do any due diligence of that sort. No. And even though I highlighted it to them that the contractor is clearly
struggling,
financial difficulty and struggling, I then sat down with the project manager and also the contract administrator to say that I'm not happy for you to be valuing the site as you are. We're not on schedule. That there may be materials on site, but we're massively behind on labour. I ended up bringing in under his contract still, so they went through him, but he couldn't find labourers. So I ended up bringing in people of my own to bring the project on site. But it should have been 6 months to get the building watertight and handed back to me. So watertight, structurally sound, and all things like that, new roof. And they ended up taking 13 months, which I was on a bridging loan and to development, and which pushed me behind on my phase to the fit out my loan was coming to an end. So where I should have had 6 to 8 months to complete the project myself on phase 2, internal fit out, I'd also got tenants lined up to move in on the 1st of September. But I ended up having just under 3 months to pull the project back on track. And I didn't lose any money on it because of the grant. You know, had I not have had that £365,000 grant, then I would have left quite a bit of, well, maybe about £60,000-70,000 in the deal. But because I had the grant funding, we got it valued up at £900,000. That was based on the income, which was just under 91, I think it was, or £92,000 a year. So I didn't lose any money on it, but absolutely everything that could have gone wrong with that site did. We even had, site security was an issue. We had people breaking in, stealing materials and things like that. So not only did they massively run over time, more than double their time, that obviously ate into my time to complete the project, which meant I had to get 17 guys on site day and night to complete the project, of which we completed end of August, in line for the tenants to move in September, and also, of course, to have the development finance paid off with our exit lender, which was Shawbrook.
I know you say that you love solving problems, right? But I go through that story and I'm thinking, how much sleep did you get? How are your fingernails? Why isn't your hair grey? Maybe it is. Maybe you now have to dye a lot because you should have more wrinkles.
I used to be brunette. Cover the grey up. No, joking aside, I've done lots of developments, and this one really was the worst I've ever done. But
it wouldn't have been the only project that you had on at the time, surely.
Well, I think that's what makes it more difficult, isn't it? Because if you're only focusing on one project at a time, you have that time to associate to that particular project. But no, I'd got multiple projects on, and of course I have multiple businesses as well. I've got estate and letters agencies, sourcing, training, and all things like that. So it was very difficult, and because I had to be on site so much, because I was keeping a diary of how many people were there, whether they were working. They were general labourers and should have been skilled tradesmen, and they wasn't. A lot of the works that they were doing had to be redone because it was wrong, which was just wasting time. So I was constantly on site, whether I should be or not. I wasn't particularly bothered at that moment in time, because every day they spent on their time, it ate into mine, and I obviously needed to deliver this project. I think the lessons I learned from that particular project as well, and it wasn't a huge project, it was only 11, so it's 4 flats but 11 rooms, which were kind of like studios with a communal kitchen area as well. So it wasn't a huge project, but there were a hell of a lot of things on that project that went wrong. And probably my biggest lesson from that is trust your gut instinct, because I was right from the beginning and should have really gone with that. B, never put your trust in anyone. I think sometimes and I never did in the beginning, but sometimes when you're a bit more established, you're working with people, your expectations of people are more. I don't know whether that's something I would never do again. Because had I have followed my normal process with that contractor, I'd have gone back to them and said, no, I don't want to use that principal contractor because their finances are shot and it's going to cause an issue and delays on my project. Instead of just relying on the fact that it's the chosen one with the grant process. I shouldn't have done that. So that's another thing. Using grant money obviously prolongs the project as well, because that takes time, and you always kind of in arrears. So you have to pay it up front and then claim it back, type of thing. So there can be cash flow issues as well. I was lucky because I got it didn't affect me in that way. But if you were kind of tight in the beginning, it could have affected me, as it would have the other developers as well. And then the other thing is, when you're working with your contract administrator who's valuing the site, make sure they bloody value it correctly. Don't take their say on, at the end of the day, you're going to have, additions and admissions, and quite often you'll see the additions are inflated and the admissions are actually deflated. So make sure you proportion that out. And with this particular project, I went through line by line and actually said, well, okay, you've calculated there to render the entire front of the property, but actually we were only doing 25% of it. So why has there only been a 25% admission on under that cost? It should be 75%. And so I think going through that to make sure that it's being done fairly, because quite often, at the end of the day, a contract administrator gets paid based off the percentage of the overall project. And so understanding that, yes, they're working for you, but there's also financial benefits.
Their wages, are linked.
Yes, make sure that you have the confidence to be able to go back and say, well, actually, this is not right. And I'm not happy with that valuation because this, and this, and I was really good on that side by doing that. And I think that's why we still managed to make money out of it. If I'd have just relied on the information from, the contract administrator and the project manager, which didn't really project manage very well at all, again, not the usual people I would work with because of the grant process, I wouldn't have, I'd have lost money on that deal even with the grant, and we'd probably still be doing it to this day. I ended up kicking them off site and issuing a non-completion certificate, which is the first time I've ever had to do that with a main contractor. And then I went in and completed the last part of phase 1 and got on with phase 2. So it was really difficult to get control of the site back. And I really had to stand my ground with that one and make sure I made a noise. And the main contractor ended up agreeing and leaving site, putting his tools down and valuing it based off the work that had been done to that point and closing it down. But in order for me to get that to happen, I had to issue my first ever non-completion statement, which I didn't want to do because it massively affects them. And he was already financially struggling and got other projects on that he wasn't able. And I didn't want to,
be the one to push him over the edge.
But at the end of the day, he, it massively impacted my site, my financial situation, and could have, if I hadn't have had the team that I had and be the hard worker that I am,
could have taken you down.
It could have, yeah. Could actually...
And I think it's really interesting when you started that off, and I was thinking, oh right, okay, so the council came to you, you worked with the heritage. There's a point there where ego could kick in for a newer person who was less experienced and go, oh, great, look, they're coming to me. This is great because I'll get lots more deals out of them. Oh, and great, I'm going to get a grant. And if you didn't, if they or one didn't have the experience that you do, to not know to go on site, to not know to keep an eye on things, to not understand how contracts work, then actually you could be coming along, a year later and picking it up off of a less experienced person because they failed to complete on the site, and you're buying it again. I mean, the number of times that they're just in simple houses, I buy deals, and you mentioned that this was a foreign investor who bought it and then the costs were too high. The number of times I come across properties where someone has bought it, someone has been told something, they've not checked out their facts. And that's just on simple buy-to-lets, never mind on developments, that people get into things that look not too good to be true, because I think when they're too good to be true, that might ring alarm bells, but they look inviting. They're presented in a way that make you think that there's an opportunity, and you see the opportunity. You don't see the steps to confirm that it is actually the opportunity that you think it is. So massive lessons there. Hayley, I think we could probably do a whole podcast, and maybe if you line up I don't know, 3 nightmares, we could do another one in the future that are called your 3 worst nightmares, and we could we could run those through, you know, like something with a big lesson on each one, because there were so many lessons in this one. I think
Well,
people are gonna.
I think this one nearly cost me my marriage.
I'm not surprised. I am not
Yeah.
surprised. Yes, and probably your son and your sanity and your health and everything else. So yes, I'm absolutely not surprised. But there's a lot who have listened and pulled out of that. And I think that, you know, if people go back over this and pick out what lessons can you pick out from that story that Hayley told? What can you identify as things that you now need to go, all right, maybe this isn't quite relevant for what I'm doing right now, but I've thought about it. I've asked myself, is this relevant? Is it grant funding? No, it isn't grant funding. Okay, that's fine. But it was about working with a contractor and checking that the contractor is financially stable in the background. I mean, we had one of those ourselves where I don't know what possessed me. I just had this moment where I got completely suckered by a nice guy. What seemed like a nice guy. And then 2 years later found out that he was basically a serial crook, and that what he did was he charmed everybody. He got all the sales patter. He was right in a niche. We were looking at an environmental development, a newish way of building, the insulated concrete form bricks and all of that sort of stuff. And we checked him out with another developer or supplier, and I didn't click with that guy, whereas this guy was very likable, seemed very knowledgeable, but of course then realized, once you see through the sales patter and then you start to see what he's done to other clients, that he does exactly the same thing. Prices for something, you pay the material, you get the materials built, and then just before you get to the end of the contract, he realizes that he's priced wrong, has to reprice because there's been a material change. But every single client had this same story. There was the first price, then there was a second price, but at that point you've got to pay it because you've already paid a large wage. So now you have to pay, you know, maybe another 10 to 20% more. And then when it comes to actually deliver, then there's a problem with the delivery. And it was the same thing. And it was almost as if we were some sort of, I don't know whether we were a Ponzi scheme, because I don't know that anybody actually got paid out of it, but, you know, some sort of how we were funding him. And then he'd got a series of companies. The more that we dug into it, there were all these companies, and he was passing money backwards and forwards behind it. And it's interesting how much more due diligence, and the minute you take your finger off of it, then that's the point at which it's like taking your finger, that story of the little boy that has his finger in the hole in the dike in Holland. The minute you take your finger out,
yeah,
that's it. That's when it can all go wrong. So
I always go with the analogy, and I always have, other than this one nightmare, really. But trust, but first verify. So
yeah,
it's not about not trusting people. It's just about verifying they are what they're supposed to be. They can deliver, and it can impact your project, your timeline, and also your financial situation. So it's not worth taking the risk. Whoever you're working with, it doesn't matter who that is, always make sure you check them out, and do your due diligence.
yeah, absolutely. And not only, you know, your finances and your profit and everything else, but also your health, your marriage, your sanity, your fingernails, the lot.
Yeah.
Well, look, Hayley, this is incredible. Let's have a think about whether we're going to do, you know, top 3 more horror stories, and we can do that maybe later in the year. Meanwhile, I just want to thank you so much for your time again. To you, the listener, we're going to put the links from Hayley's first podcast recording with us in the show notes, so that you'll be able to go back if you haven't already heard her or met her. And in the meanwhile, we'll also take all of Hayley's details and stick them in there so that you can follow her and know how to find out more about her. But Hayley Andrews, awesome role model as a female property developer, property investor, and everything else that you do. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
And look forward to speaking to you again. And for everybody else, I think that if you just listen to what Hayley is saying, just like some of the latest bits that come in there, trust, yes, but verify. Know the facts of who you're working with. Know that something and someone is what they say they are. And then looking at how you're going to monitor something, that whole idea of project and keeping time checks, check on everybody in all parts of a business, whether it is a painter just simply painting your buy-to-let property that you want to put back on the market, or it's actually a developer on site and whether the rendering has been done. Keep an eye on site and keep an eye on that. And then I think the big one for me always, and you'll know this if you're a regular listener, is the maths. So we haven't used the word maths or spreadsheet specifically, but that is very much what Hayley has been talking about, knowing the numbers, and from that, your market, your exit strategies and all that involved. So some massive lessons in here. And I hope that what you've got out of this is some inspiration towards the potential of development, but also a recognition that maybe it's not for the faint-hearted. It's something that you need to cut your teeth on, something that you need to build up to, something that can be very enjoyable. I think if you've watched this on YouTube, you'll see that even when telling a horror story, Hayley has been smiling. She's still there on the other side of it and she's enjoyed it, but you're looking at, this is not that any of it is easy. This is just not easy stuff. This is something that requires skills. Hayley, you're a superstar. Thank you so much. And like I say, let's have a chat off camera and see if I can get you back for a third one. Thank you very much.
My mission is to help people like you understand what a wealthy life truly entails. Together, we'll identify your ideal lifestyle, leverage your resources to generate the necessary income through property investment, whether by teaching you how or by managing the process on your behalf. Let's inject some momentum into your wealthy life plans as you subscribe now to capture every episode of the podcast, and then get in touch via my website, book a call. All of the details are in the show notes.